When you think of ancient Sparta, you probably think of King Leonidas, right? You know, the 300 warriors, a whole state built on the backs of this elite, super militarized group of citizens. But that picture? It's missing something absolutely crucial. It's missing the very foundation everything stood on. So today, let's go looking for the invisible people who actually held Sparta together.
I mean, here's the central puzzle of Sparta, isn't it? The actual Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, were a tiny, tiny minority. And get this, they were forbidden from farming or doing any kind of trade or manual labor. So, how did they feed their families? How did they equip their armies and control this huge territory? Well, the answer lies with a group that history pretty much forgot.
And here they are. Meet the Perioikoi. The name literally means the dwellers around. These were free people, living in the lands all around Sparta proper, but they weren't citizens, and they weren't just neighbors. No. They were the essential and yet completely invisible pillars of the entire Spartan state.
Now, we're calling them a ghost population for a reason, because trying to find them in the history books, it's incredibly difficult. They were everywhere in Spartan life, but it seems like ancient writers just look right through them. So why is that?
Well, it really boils down to this one simple fact. Ancient historians, they were interested in the big stuff, wars, political drama, major decisions. The Perioikoi didn't have their own foreign policy. They just followed Sparta's lead. By working so well within the system, they became, well, uninteresting. They weren't a problem, and so they became invisible. That means we have to be detectives, piecing together the clues they left behind.
So, let's start our investigation where the evidence is the strongest, on the battlefield. Because this is the one place where the Perioikoi suddenly step out of the shadows and into the history books in a huge way.
Okay, let's take the legendary Battle of Plataea in 479 BC. This was a massive turning point in the Persian Wars. The historian Herodotus tells us that Sparta sent a force of 10,000 of its best heavy infantry. But here's where it gets really interesting. It's how that number breaks down.
Just think about that for a second. Of those 10,000 elite soldiers, 5,000 were full Spartan citizens, and the other 5,000 were Perioikoi. They weren't just backup or support troops, they were half of Sparta's main battle line. And believe me, this was not a one-time thing.
Fast forward a few decades to the Peloponnesian War. The historian Thucydides describes a crisis where Sparta needed soldiers, and fast. And look who answers the call, standing shoulder to shoulder, the Spartiates and the Perioikoi. Thucydides says they went immediately, which tells you everything. This wasn't some emergency draft. This was a well-oiled machine. Their participation was routine, it was expected, and it was absolutely essential. And what's more, not all Perioikoi were just lumped together. There was this one group, the Skiritai, who were so respected for their fighting skills that they were given the permanent, privileged honor of holding the left flank of the entire Spartan army. That's a position of immense trust. They even fought as their own distinct unit. This tells us that even within this system, if you are excellent, you could be recognized and rewarded. Okay, so they were military powerhouses. But that's not the whole story, not by a long shot. If the Perioikoi were Sparta's military muscle, they were also its economic engine. Now, the evidence here is a bit more subtle, but it's just as powerful.
It all starts with this one simple, unbreakable rule of Spartan society. As the writer Plutarch tells us, Spartan citizens were strictly forbidden from doing any kind of craft or trade. Their one and only job was to be a soldier. Period.
Well, that brings up a pretty obvious question, doesn't it? If the Spartans weren't making their iconic bronze shields, or their swords, or their helmets, who was?
The only logical conclusion, what historians call a reasonable inference, is that the Perioikoi filled this massive economic void. They had to be the blacksmiths, the potters, the miners, and the traders who equipped the entire Spartan war machine and kept its society running.
And their economic role was incredibly diverse. Sure, many were farmers, but those in coastal towns like Gythion, which was Sparta's main port, they would have been fishermen and sailors and traders. Others worked the mines, digging up the iron and lead needed for war. They were, simply put, the entire productive class that let the Spartans focus only on fighting.
So this brings us to what I think is the most fascinating part of this whole mystery. What did the Perioikoi actually think about this arrangement? They fought for Sparta, they died for Sparta, they fueled its economy, but they had zero say in its politics. Were they loyal collaborators, or were they just resentful captives?
Well, the evidence for loyalty is honestly
Shocking. In 464 BC, a massive earthquake flattened Sparta. This sparked a huge revolt by the enslaved Helots. I mean, this was the perfect moment for the Perioikoi to break free. And yet, out of dozens and dozens of their towns, only 2 joined the rebellion. 2. The rest of them, they stayed loyal.
And yet, there's this. Decades later, the writer Xenophon reports a feeling that is just chillingly different. He says that some people believe the Perioikoi's hatred for the Spartans ran so deep they would gladly eat them raw. Wow, that is visceral. So which is it? Unbreakable loyalty or just pure, raw hatred?
The truth, as it often is, was probably somewhere in between. On the one hand, they likely had a lot of freedom to run their own towns day to day. They shared in the spoils of war and built real bonds with Spartans on the battlefield. But, on the other hand, they were completely subordinate. They had to follow Sparta into any war it chose, with no say in the matter. It was this really complex balance of mutual benefit and absolute control.
Which brings us all the way back to our original question. If they were so incredibly important, why do we have to work this hard to even find them? Why did history forget the invisible pillars of Sparta?
Well, I think the case closes with 3 key findings. First, as we said, they didn't make their own big political decisions, so there was nothing for historians to really write about. Second, unlike the very strange and exotic Spartans, the Perioikoi lived pretty normal Greek lives, which just wasn't as interesting to ancient authors. And third, and this is the big one, the system just worked. Their collaboration was so successful that they never became a problem for Sparta, and historians love to write about problems.
And that leads us to the central paradox of this whole story. Their total invisibility in the history books is actually the strongest evidence we have of their success. They were so essential, so perfectly integrated into how the state worked, that they just blended into the background, unseen, unrecorded, but holding the whole thing up.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thought. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many essential systems or groups of people are the invisible pillars holding up our own world, working so well, so seamlessly that we barely even notice they're there?